Assalamu alaikum everyone, this is Asadullah Ali of the Andalusian Project coming at you today with a supplementary iJihad video. You see, the masked Arab has finally decided to respond to iJihad episode 4. You heard that right. The masked Arab has responded to iJihad episode 4. So this video will be a response to that response. Now, unlike my opponent, I don't intend to rant as much and will be as concise as possible when addressing his arguments. That said, I want my viewers to watch his entire video prior to watching my response, so you can understand the context behind this missive. As for the disclaimer that you saw at the beginning, I don't want my viewers to take it too seriously, because I put it there for a very specific reason, which will be explained later. That said, the masked Arab did not disappoint me with his response. I even predicted everything he would do prior to its release, and in fact, he went above and beyond my expectations. For example, the first 30 minutes of his video is pretty much just a massive attempt at character assassination. Now, his apparent justification for his tantrum is that he thinks I smeared his character through an ad hominem fallacy, by accusing him of being dishonest. Thus, he thinks I deserve a quote-unquote proportionate response. However, prior to addressing this accusation, I just want to say that I find it quite odd that he would even complain to such a degree about being accused of dishonesty. Especially when he makes these accusations all the time. All you need to do is look at his Twitter feed and you will find numerous instances where he accuses people he disagrees with of dishonesty. For example, they, apologists, are unfortunately willingly and consciously dishonest. Some of these apologists have no shame or an ounce of integrity. In another tweet, he claims that only on rare occasions does one debate an honest Muslim. Therefore, the majority of those he debates are apparently dishonest. Here he says, believing in religions in the information age means you are either ignorant of your religion's doctrine or aware and intellectually dishonest. And here he makes it very clear that only dishonest Muslims try to argue against him. But even more revealing is the following tweet. The difference between Islamic State and moderate Muslims is they both know the Quran is violent. ISIS embraces it, moderates deny it. And in a later tweet he explains the context behind this supposed denial in a response to another user. Because moderate Muslims think propping up an old book and denying its violent instructions with dishonest lies is the way to go. So apparently the only difference between ISIS and moderate Muslims is that the former embraces violence while the latter denies it. And how do moderate Muslims deny it? That's right, apparently every Muslim that disagrees with ISIS is being dishonest. So if the masked Arab doesn't like being accused of dishonesty, maybe he shouldn't set the tone in advance. Just saying. But what's even more peculiar about his little rant is that he thinks it quote-unquote proportionate to my refutations. In response to me accusing him of dishonesty, he goes so far as to claim that I'm basically a deranged extremist who wants to murder people for criticizing Islam. Now, it seems to me completely outside the realm of reason to think this a quote-unquote proportionate response. But hey, he has said on numerous occasions that he used to be an extremist himself. So I suppose we can't blame him for still having some of those traits. Did you hear that? That is an example of a proportionate response. Despite all this, I never actually committed an ad hominem against the masked Arab. You see, an ad hominem is an irrelevant attack on the arguer in an attempt to undermine their argument. So the problem here should already be obvious. Because nowhere did I just randomly insult the masked Arab and then declare his arguments wrong. No, the entire point of my refutations was to prove that he was being dishonest with Islamic sources. So here it seems that the masked Arab has misunderstood the application of the ad hominem fallacy. His accusation is so absurd that he may as well claim that court trials are an ad hominem because prosecution lawyers set out to prove people as criminals. However, the masked Arab has smeared my character in the form of an ad hominem.
He'll probably portray this as some kind of character assassination, but I'm not suggesting this has anything to do with his arguments. His arguments have to be judged exclusively far from his deranged nature, and we will get to them. This is just so others out there are fully aware of what kind of person they're dealing with before they decide on whether or not they should engage with him in discussion.
This is what is commonly known as the fallacy of poisoning the well, which is a preemptive attack on a person in order to discredit their testimony or argument in advance of their giving it. A person who thereby becomes unreceptive to the testimony reasons fallaciously and has become a victim of the poisoner. This is ironic, to say in the least. And once again, I don't recall spending 30 minutes at the beginning of my videos smearing the masked Arab's character and then making the excuse, "Don't worry everyone, this has nothing to do with his arguments. I just wanted to warn you all about his deranged mentality before you try to have a discussion with him. Despite this, I do think it's important to briefly address his accusations, because I understand how emotional some people can be. But if you already consider me innocent of these accusations, then please feel free to skip ahead by looking at the table of contents in the info box. With that said, allow me to offer a defense of my character. Regarding the accusation that I threatened someone and tried to have him killed, this is patently false. The video that you were shown was me responding to someone who was advocating, fantasizing about, and giving a veiled threat of genocide to Muslims. After I responded to him, he then saw fit to misrepresent my statement as a death threat against him for quote-unquote criticizing Islam. After months and months of attempting to reason with this person and stop him from slandering me, I decided to notify the university he worked at, asking the Muslim and non-Muslim staff and students to file formal complaints. And if you think me doing this equates to trying to kill someone, then that's a problem of prejudice, not of my supposedly evil intentions. That said, there is plenty of evidence behind these events. You can just go to the playlist provided on my older channel, where you will find not only evidence of this individual's threat against Muslims, but even atheists defending me against his slander. For example,
if you're going to pray to Allah for anything, beg him that you never meet the giant in such a mood. For your continued existence is entirely at the discretion and goodwill of the giant, and that it is all that stands between you being granted continued existence, and you receiving yourself the self-same judgment that you would so zealously impose on the rest of the world if only you had the power.
Let's just focus in on one thing here.
And that it is all that stands between you being granted continued existence, and you receiving yourself the self-same judgment that you would so zealously impose on the rest of the world if only you had the power.
Self-same judgment. What was that again?
That if such power were delivered into the primitive hands of a theocracy, that genocide of the infidel and doing Allah's work would be synonymous terms.
So, you have, if religious lunatics had their way, they would commit genocide. If you piss off the giant, you will receive the self-same judgment. If you cannot see where Ali could have gotten the idea that Thunderfoot was threatening innocent people, then I really don't know what to tell you. Incidentally, I don't think that's what Thunderfoot meant, because I give him the benefit of the doubt as to not being a genocidal lunatic who wants to kill innocent people. That said, he certainly chose his words very poorly. I have heard far too many people say, oh, we should just nuke the whole Middle East, to not be aware of the fact that, you should be careful in what you're implying in what you say. I mean, you should in general, but in this case, I think that Thunderfoot dropped the ball.
But Thunderfoot, what you did is you took his words and you didn't even address them. It wasn't that you just misrepresented them or you quote mined them even. I mean, you put the entire thing in its entirety and then went on about how, oh, poor Muslim man, how dare you insult, how dare you threaten me because of my freedom of speech. That's not what he was talking about. There was no mention of free speech in there. There was no mention of insulting Islam in there. None of his video was talking about that. His words were, if you threaten the lives of innocent people, Muslim and non-Muslim, then Quran says that we can send you to the God that you wish you knew. It's not like he did not say at any point, and at no point does that sentence mean if you insult Islam we will send you to the gods. No, if you threaten the lives of innocent people, Muslim or non-Muslim, that is what he said, and you completely misrepresented him, and I think you misrepresented him, which is why you have not made a correct comment about it.
And you're apparently aware that he views himself as a bit of a victim. Because he is, dude. You victimized that guy. You painted a specific narrative in the most unsympathetic light possible about this person. when in truth what he was doing was responding to you, in which you basically stated a thing that probably go unstated, which is that the Western world, let's be clear about it, we're talking about America, could bomb the entire globe back into the Dark Ages, into the Stone Ages, excuse me. Now, that would be an inconsequential observation if you had made it in a neutral way, but what you did was you packaged it all up into a specific narrative. And that narrative was such that you were basically implying that you were part of a culture that only allows people to live in this world because we feel like it. And that you are somehow just gonna remind everybody, you know, you live at our pleasure. It's the creepiest version of nanny boo-boo I think I've ever seen.
But you see, the masked Arab is already aware of all of this, as are his closest supporters who helped him dig up this information. Case in point, Reason on Faith. Here in the comment section of the masked Arab's recent video, you can see him admitting that I indeed thought myself responding to a threat of genocide. He even goes so far as to defend the person I was responding to, by claiming that he wasn't threatening Muslims, but just issuing a civil message to the world that genocide would be committed. Because, you know, this isn't completely insane or anything, right? And both the masked Arab and Reason on Faith basically justify me being slandered because they think I look like a terrorist. They even go so far as to describe my tone of voice and even my facial features.
Says here you robbed a hospital? Why'd you do that?
Yeah, I'm not guilty.
That's not what the other lawyer said.
I mean,
Listen, you gotta get me on the stand, okay? I can explain everything. We can take him to your house. We'll show him the pod that I came here.
Shut up! Now, prosecutor, why you think you done it?
Okay, number one, Your Honor. Just look at him.
He talks like a fag, too.
And B, we've got all this, like, evidence.
Please listen.
Please listen.
I didn't steal anything. I was part of an army experiment.
Joe stated his case logically and passionately, but his perceived effeminate voice only drew big gales of stupid laughter.
You did!
Without adequate legal representation, Joe was given a stiff sentence.
I guess Muslims aren't allowed to be angry when they're threatened with genocide, because apparently that makes us look like terrorists. Take that as you will. So I find it utterly deplorable that I would be accused of all this when the very people who made this presentation already know my side of the story and dismiss it because they find it convenient to undermine my credibility. It's also extremely unethical to accuse me of terroristic criminal activity when I've spent a great deal of my life as a Muslim combating terrorism, even working alongside the Malaysian government as a counter-terrorism expert. You can even find several videos on my own channel where I'm giving lectures and interviews on this very topic. So if you're wondering why Islamophobes are always complaining about Muslims not doing enough to combat terrorism, now you have your answer, because apparently they're too busy putting us all in the same basket. But hey, if you still think me a deranged terrorist who wants to kill innocent people, be my guest. You see, I'm currently living in the United States, so allow me to provide you with the contact information of two organizations. The first number is to Homeland Security, and the link is to the FBI. So if you honestly believe I'm a threat to innocent people, then you should do your moral duty and contact the authorities right away. After you present your quote-unquote evidences to them, let me know how much they laughed at you. Meanwhile, I'll just continue making these debunking videos, because, you know, apparently that's what terrorists do with their spare time. As for the accusation that I am opposed to human rights, that's partially correct, but it doesn't mean I endorse genocide or any other immoral thing you can think of. I'm opposed to the philosophy of human rights precisely because I believe the concept, in its current form, is antithetical to what it means to be human. I even make this clear in one of the lectures I've uploaded on this very channel. These notions of a universal type of human being, separated from their political, religious, or value-laden context, dehumanizes them. It makes them nothing but human, as it were. And to be human, as it were, doesn't mean anything without understanding what our ideas are and what our values are. And it replaces the concept of human with superficial notions such as race and ethnicity. It also allows something else. It allows nations in power behind this idea of neutral and universal human rights, those who control these aspects, these legalities, to give those values to non-humans. It gives them the right to give these values to so-called non-humans, people who have been so-called deprived of the human rights that they themselves arbitrarily give to them. It gives these nations the right to coerce other nations, to bomb, to destroy other nations for the sake of giving these so-called neutral rights to those who have lost them, without any consideration for what the values or beliefs of those people actually are. Some greater examples we can mention are what? Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya. Under the impression that we were giving human rights to these individuals, the United States and other allied powers went in, destroyed these nations, imposed upon them human rights, as it were. And now these nations are in far more chaos, destruction, than they were prior.
As for me being rather unpleasant with people at times, this is also partially true. I can be a bit of a jerk, but I only act this way in response to jerks. Is this necessarily a good thing? Not really, but it's not like I'm doing this randomly. For example, in the Masked Arab's video, he shows this comment I made to Sheikh Monkfish on Facebook, but he curiously doesn't show the comments made by that user prior. So here they are. As you can see, this guy isn't exactly very nice. He just randomly showed up on my post where I'm advertising a lecture I'm giving later this month, and starts arrogantly bashing my credentials and those of the other speakers. So this is what prompted my response. But even after I did this, I tried to extend an olive branch, informing this person why I responded the way that I did, and telling them that if they wanted to have a discussion, they just need to be nicer. And this happens more often than you think. You see, I've been talking to atheists and ex-Muslims for nearly a decade, and it seems that a sizable minority of them possess an intellectual superiority complex that compels them to constantly harass and belittle people they disagree with, even if those people are better educated and have actual credentials. Now, personally, I've never felt the need to disrespect people or disregard their credentials simply because they were an atheist or a Christian or a Jew, but for some strange reason, I face this sort of attitude from atheists and ex-Muslims on a daily basis. So pardon me for feeling annoyed at times. The Masked Arab also complains about the following graphic, accusing me of being childish and representative of the mentality of my fanbase. But I find this an odd complaint considering how he's used similar comedy at the expense of others. For example, like when he opens his videos presenting Muslims as barbaric savages trying to kill him.
So I'm finally back, and the reaction to my return may be different depending on who's watching.
Allahu Akbar!
Or when he makes childish little skits showing that Muslims are too stupid to respond to his criticisms.
I hate you, you stinky infidel.
Oh, yeah, I'll give you that one.
So the Masked Arab set the tone long before my videos were ever released. It's only now that he disapproves because he's on the receiving end of it. Permitting one more point before we get to the substance of his refutation, I just want to make something clear. You see this? This little icon is called a location. If you take a look at Twitter, it has the same icon. How curious. Therefore, the description next to it is not a claim of identity, but of where one resides. Therefore, I do not identify as Islamophobes' worst nightmare. In other words, it's a joke. But according to the Masked Arab, he identifies as the Virgo supercluster, a group of galaxies. But am I going to mock the Masked Arab now for thinking himself to be a supercluster of galaxies? No, I'm not. Because that would be stupid. So now that we've gotten all that nonsense out of the way, let's examine some bigger nonsense, shall we? Now, in order to do this, we will need to begin by looking at the first two videos of the Masked Arab series on Islam and ISIS. The first video deals with terrorism and extremism, and the second with killing innocent civilians. Now, these two videos are essentially the same. However, what makes them particularly notable is that they are the foundation for the rest of the series. In other words, if significant errors can be found in these videos, then dominoes will fall.
Wow, he claims that they're the foundation for the rest of the series. Says who? Says the iJihadi? Why would they be the foundation for the rest of the series? Each topic has its own video. This is a guy who likes to impress his gullible audience by stating that he studied philosophy and repeating the word fallacy every few minutes to make it sound like what we just saw was indeed a fallacy. We'll soon see he's the king of fallacies, especially when it comes to red herrings and straw man arguments. But here he's starting with such a huge facepalm moment by suggesting that the rest of the videos will fall because of what he suggests may be significant errors in these videos. No rational human would make such a ridiculous composition fallacy like that with a straight face. Every topic is independent of the next.
Here, the Masked Arab accuses me of committing the fallacy of composition, which is when someone mistakenly assumes that a characteristic of some or all the individuals in a group is also a characteristic of the group itself. However, he doesn't actually show what characteristic I've mistakenly assumed. Rather, he assumes himself that I believe all the videos in his series are the same topic. But nowhere in my video do I state this. All I say is that his first two videos are the foundation for the rest of the series. So how can he presume that I've committed this fallacy if he doesn't even know what characteristic I'm referring to? Now, do I believe there is a consistent characteristic that can be found throughout his series? Yes, I do. Because as I state in the video itself, what I'm attempting to prove is that the Masked Arab has a dishonest methodology. Now, to be fair, the Masked Arab does attempt to present authentic sources throughout his videos. That said, he does so in a purposefully selective manner, twisting those sources to suit his own agenda so as to deceive his audience. Now, if you don't believe me, that's perfectly fine, because by the end of this episode, you will. You see, we will be using the very same sources as the Masked Arab to prove this accusation. That's right, the very same sources, links and all. So what makes all these videos similar is not their topics, but the way in which he presents them. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean everything he says in his series is wrong, but it does showcase that his videos are not based on objective research or integrity. Therefore, not only have I not committed this fallacy, but the Masked Arab doesn't even know where I did so. Moving on.
So, let's begin in this video with issue number 1. Oh dear. Now the first thing you should ask is this. Why on earth has this apologist not started at the outset of my video? What is he hiding? I, on the other hand, have started at the start of his video, not missing a single frame. I may skip some film clips he adds in for comedy or speed up his slow graphics a bit, but we'll listen to everything he says. So why has the iJihadi started playing my video at the 3-minute 10-second mark? Has he missed anything out that completely invalidates his entire arguments and videos from the outset? Has he done this on purpose because he's deceptive? Something he's had the audacity of accusing me of? I don't know. Maybe it was deliberate. Maybe he missed it because his reading comprehension, something he says he's great at, was in fact not that great. So let's take a look at the first 6 seconds of my video that he's responding to. And that's a warning message because the content is not necessarily for everyone. Okay, let's pause there. Only 5 seconds into my video and I explain exactly what I'm doing with the video series. Let's read it, shall we, since the iJihadi never showed you this because it invalidates his entire video. This series looks at whether or not the Islamic State group, ISIS, can justify their actions in any way from primary Islamic sources. That sentence speaks for itself. See, unlike the Quran, my sentences are clear and the message is obvious. I'm saying here that I want to see whether or not ISIS can justify their actions in any way from primary Islamic sources. You could never refute that. You can say, let's look at what this particular exegesis says instead, or you can say, let's skip 50 pages in front or 30 pages behind to read another quote and see whether we find contradictions, but the original quotes and teachings remain. I never once said that everything ISIS does is exactly #TrueIslam is at its core. Even in this video, as we'll see in a moment, I make that very clear. But my money is on the iJihadi being incredibly deceptive yet again, banking on a largely ignorant audience, not making the effort to cross-check his constant smear attacks. So what we have here is an absolute huge straw man from the very outset that he builds his entire refutation series on altogether. His videos are now completely debunked, as he's set himself to respond to a straw man because he chose to completely ignore the beginning of the video, which sets out the aim of the series. Let's continue with my video and see what else he missed. I will be breaking down this series into the following sections you see on screen. Some of these topics will overlap. For example, beheadings is placed separately to brutality, but that's only done so we can focus on each element in more detail. I will be as objective as I can be during the series, and I've researched as much as I can to show both sides of the argument where this is applicable, without going through any mental gymnastics and Note here what I say.
There will be topics where I think ISIS are following Islam closely, and others where I think they may take some things in a cherry-picked fashion by seeming to ignore some credible sources.
Shall we repeat it?
There will be topics where I think ISIS are following Islam closely, and others where I think they may take some things in a cherry-picked fashion by seeming to ignore some credible sources.
Notice how only now, after I've said all this, is where his video picks up. Has he deliberately misled his audience into thinking I've claimed Islam unequivocally equals ISIS? That's the impression he's left his viewers, and that's the straw man he has built up when it's clearly not what I've repeatedly said from the very outset of this series. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the state of Muslim apologists today. Zero integrity in representing any opposing positions fairly.
This is perhaps the masked Arab's most forceful criticism to my refutations, and he spends a great deal of time making this his winning formula. Here, the masked Arab accuses me of being deceptive and committing a straw man of his arguments, because apparently I was dismissive of his disclaimer at the beginning of his series. However, it is clear from my very own video that I never accused the masked Arab of claiming that everything ISIS does is Islam. In fact, I state the contrary. So the masked Arab has gained a large following due to being an ex-Muslim who happens to critique Islam. He is most well known for arguing that ISIS is a near-perfect representation of Islamic teachings. Let's hear that again, shall we? He is most well known for arguing that ISIS is a
near-perfect representation of Islamic teachings.
That's right. I state clearly at the beginning of my video that the masked Arab is popular for presenting ISIS as a near-perfect representation of Islamic teachings. The word near-perfect or almost perfect does not equate to unequivocal 100% similarity. And the reason I said this is because I was already aware of his disclaimer. So the deception and strawmanning he thinks I've committed is merely a matter of projection on his part. He then goes on to try and bolster his accusation against me by using an irrelevant discussion on Reddit. Now remember, the masked Arab has accused me of committing a straw man by claiming that he believes everything ISIS does is Islam. Remember that.
And if you thought his dishonesty couldn't get any worse, trust me, it does. See, this straw man has not gone unmentioned to Asadullah the Jihadi. Several people have asked him why he decided to misrepresent my position and attack a straw man by leaving out the opening part of the video, and he flat out refuses to acknowledge I said it. He probably knows his audience won't go and check my video because they're not that sophisticated if we're being honest, so he can get away with these endless lies. Let's read the exchange he had with Reason on Faith, shall we? To begin with, Reason on Faith really describes Asadullah's techniques very well. Asadullah, I find that repeatedly the method you employ is one of 1. False dichotomies, 2. Implanting motivations to others as if you have divine knowledge. I think that's a big sin in your religion called shirk, no. And 3, misrepresenting people's statements so that you can do number 1 and number 2. But later on he says to him, several other points can be addressed, such as whether TMA even claimed Islam is synonymous with ISIS. He didn't. He only claimed that material in Islamic sources can be found that they can draw from to develop the positions they have. Now my video was only 8 minutes long. This guy is telling you you've misrepresented my position by leaving this out altogether, because it invalidates your entire refutation. So what does the Jihadi say? Will he admit that he's made a mistake? Will he retract his video? Or will he double down on his lies? Let's see. How can you possibly disagree? Nowhere does he state what you're claiming. He clearly thinks ISIS is drawing from authentic sources / teachings of Islam, not cherry picking. But I just said those exact words. I said sometimes ISIS cherry picks. This guy talks about people struggling with reading comprehension, but either he struggles with listening comprehension or he has zero integrity. And given that you've just been told exactly where to look, you've doubled down on your denial because you realize the consequences it has on your argument, and they are disastrous.
So here, the masked Arab is trying to deceive his audience by conflating this irrelevant Reddit discussion with my so-called straw man that he's fabricated from thin air. And why is this discussion irrelevant to said straw man? Well, first, it's important to note that this Reddit discussion is about my second refutation video on the Masked Arab, iJihad Episode 5, where I'm analyzing the third video in his series. More importantly, however, Reason on Faith is arguing a completely different point from the Masked Arab himself. Here, Reason on Faith is merely suggesting that the Masked Arab never conflated ISIS's justification of their actions through Islamic sources with Islam itself. This is his argument, and this is what I'm responding to. Nowhere does Reason on Faith state that I ever argued that the Masked Arab believes everything ISIS does is Islam. Even so, it is clear from this discussion that I was prepared for this objection, because I made it known to Reason on Faith that I already addressed it in my video. As you can see here, in my very first reply, I provided a timestamp where this specific objection had been addressed. However, not surprisingly, the Masked Arab skips over this because he thinks his audience too stupid to realize what's right in front of them. So allow me to quote myself from iJihad Episode 5 at 43 minutes 43 seconds. Maybe this entire time, he hasn't been arguing for what Islam actually teaches, but how ISIS uses Islamic sources to suit their own agenda. But if this is really his argument, then how can one claim that Islam is the primary reason behind their actions? Cherry-picking doesn't automatically become less fallacious when you use it on religion. It is still an invalid measure by which to determine influence. To suggest otherwise would merely be a case of committing the fallacy of special pleading, which is applying a general principle to various situations, but not applying it to a special situation that interests the arguer, even though the general principle properly applies to that special situation as well. However, I'm sure someone will object by appealing to postmodernist apologetics, claiming that Islam is whatever people want it to be. Therefore, every interpretation is valid. But this is nonsense, because Islam is not whatever people want it to be, and every interpretation is not valid. If the opposite were true, then there would be no Islam to talk about, because putting together a bunch of mutually exclusive interpretations under one umbrella doesn't magically equate to a coherent concept. Even so, I would find it ironic if this objection was made, because when people like the Masked Arab suggest that Islam promotes terrorism, or Islam promotes extremism, or Islam promotes this or that, they don't have in mind a bunch of different Islams. No. They only have in mind one Islam. It's only when they are corrected that Islam suddenly becomes a rainbow of different interpretations immune to criticism. How convenient. And the reason I made this argument is because I anticipated that the Masked Arab would try to use some nonsensical postmodernist apologetics in order to save his video from criticism, even though it's clearly apparent that he does in fact conflate drawing from Islamic sources with Islam itself. We need only look at his disclaimer as evidence of this. Notice the first part where he states that he will be showing whether or not ISIS can justify their behavior in any way from Islamic sources. Only a little later, he conflates this with Islam itself, where he clearly says,
"There will be topics where I think ISIS are following Islam closely, and others where I think they may take some things in a cherry-picked fashion by seeming to ignore some credible sources."
Now, anyone who has watched my videos knows that I am refuting the first part of this statement where he believes ISIS is following Islam closely with respect to terrorism and extremism, killing innocent people, and offensive jihad, i.e. the topics of his first 3 videos, which my refutations address. But if the Masked Arab now wants to twist his own words so as to claim that justify in any way includes cherry-picking, then why would he put this statement in opposition to following Islam closely, thus contradicting himself? This makes absolutely no sense. As for this comment where I say he thinks ISIS is not cherry-picking, this is in regard to the 3 videos I'm addressing in my refutations, not his entire series. Even the Masked Arab himself claims that his first 3 videos are examples where ISIS is following Islam closely, not cherry-picking. Case in point, we need only review the closing remarks of these 3 videos.
So, in conclusion for point 1, does Islam endorse terrorism and extremism? We unfortunately find these actions are encouraged and even ordered in numerous Quranic verses, a fact supported by numerous reputable commentaries and hadiths. So, to sum this point up on Islamic doctrine justifying civilian killings, it appears that it's largely tolerated, at least for non-Muslim men. They don't have to be doing these killings in battle. Women and children, as well as others deemed weak like the elderly or blind, cannot be targeted deliberately, but can be killed if they are among the men. So in conclusion, fighting in the way of Allah is not only tolerated, it's most definitely encouraged. A verse tells Muslims not to call for peace if they are in a position of strength. Those who don't fight are told that they are hypocrites. The Quran tells Muslims fighting is good for them even if they don't realize it, and many scholars have interpreted these verses as being a call for constant war until Islam dominates the entire world.
And if you still don't believe that the masked Arab thinks ISIS is following Islam closely with regard to terrorism and extremism, we need only look at his Twitter feed. For example, 6 months prior to the release of his series on ISIS, he stated the following: "Vast majority of terrorists are Muslims. There are imams condemning Islamic State, but it's futile given that Islamic State just follows Islam." And a year after the release of his ISIS series, he remained consistent in this respect. The longer we deflect from Islamic doctrine and cry Islamophobia for legitimate criticisms, the longer we allow terrorism to flourish. Elsewhere he states, "Terrorists will keep laughing at Westerners bending over backwards to deny a connection with Islamic ideology and strike again and again and again." And in another tweet, he writes that those who deny connection between Orthodox Islam and terrorism are in denial. So in summary, his most forceful response to me amounts to nothing more than him putting words in my mouth and trying to support his deception by propping up an irrelevant discussion between me and one of his followers. Not only that, but it now seems that he's indirectly using Reason on Faith's argument to claim that he never conflated justify in any way from Islamic sources with following Islam closely, even though his own disclaimer, statements within his own videos, and his Twitter feed all state the contrary. Therefore, this is nothing less than a desperate and pathetic attempt by the masked Arab to undermine criticism. But even more absurd is the fact that he seems to believe his disclaimer makes his arguments quote-unquote irrefutable. Well, according to his own logic then, the disclaimer at the beginning of my response makes both my refutation videos, including this one, irrefutable. Therefore, it's impossible that I'm strawmanning him. But I'm not seriously going to argue that my disclaimer makes my videos irrefutable, because that would be stupid. And this is the difference between someone who has studied philosophy and critical thinking at the academic level versus a masked man on YouTube who thinks himself intelligent simply by virtue of lacking belief in God. You see, one of us goes to great lengths to use proper reasoning and evidence to support their conclusions, whereas the other provides silly disclaimers they believe magically make their arguments irrefutable like some intellectual safe space. Moving on, the masked Arab offers what is perhaps the most ludicrous excuse I have ever heard anyone utter.
Anyway, let's now go back to his video and see how he commits another colossal strawman and yet another embarrassing error. Terrorism and extremism. Here I want to speak about these two issues in the general sense. Okay, did you hear what I just said? The very first sentence of my argument in this video says, "Here I want to speak about these two issues in the general sense." By referring to them in the general sense, I'm using terrorism as a verb, to terrorize, which is to inflict fear. That's the general sense of the term. I made this clear in the very first sentence I utter on this very topic, but what does the iJihadi prefer to do instead? Let's see.
At the very beginning of the masked Arab's argument, we already have a major problem. However, it's very subtle. In order to explain it, we need to start with the definition of terrorism, which is broadly defined as the unlawful use of violence and intimidation, especially against civilians, in the pursuit of political aims. Now, while it is true that the Arabic word for terrorism is irhab, it is literally impossible for any word in the Quran to be representative of this phenomenon. Why? Well, because the word terrorism wasn't coined until the late 18th century during the French Revolution. The term was coined by a political party called the Jacobins, who used it as a self-reference for their own policies.
So here he sets out on his straw man, completely ignoring the first sentence I uttered in relation to this term.
Here, the masked Arab is seriously trying to argue that when he claimed the Quran promotes terrorism, he meant it in the quote-unquote general sense, as a verb that means to inflict fear. Yeah, because when you talk about a word in the general sense, it magically becomes a verb that provides no substantial representation to its actual meaning. I mean, people who are scared of heights are obviously experiencing terrorism in the general sense, and people who watch scary movies, they too are experiencing terrorism in the general sense. And when people read the title of the masked Arab's video, it obviously means Islam and ISIS, terrorism, in the general sense as a verb that means to inflict fear and extremism. Right. Sarcasm aside, this response is frankly insulting to anyone with average intelligence, and it clearly shows that the masked Arab has an even lower opinion of his audience than I do. No, the general meaning of the noun terrorism is not a verb that means to inflict fear. The general meaning of the noun terrorism is the definition of the noun terrorism, which is the unlawful use of violence and intimidation, especially against civilians, in the pursuit of political aims. But I don't need to tell you this because even the masked Arab himself doesn't believe the nonsense he just spewed. Case in point, in a prior conversation on his Twitter feed, he makes it clear that terrorism generally implies violence with a political motivation. You can understand this clearly from the fact that he's responding to someone asking why one act of violence is considered terrorism, but the other isn't. So I'm not going to buy what the masked Arab is trying to sell here. Rather than simply admitting that he fallaciously conflated the term terror with the word terrorism, he has chosen to double down by redefining the general meaning of the latter as merely inflicting fear. In other words, the masked Arab has committed what is known as the definist fallacy, which occurs when someone unfairly defines a term so that a controversial position is made easier to defend. To showcase just how absurd the masked Arab's excuse is, allow me to provide an analogy. Imagine for a moment that the masked Arab didn't make a video on Islam and terrorism, but Shakespeare and homosexuality. Bear with me. Now, as you're watching his video, you come to his first argument, where he states the following. Homosexuality. Here I want to speak about this issue in the general sense. Homosexuality is often represented in the English language by the word gay. First question. Does Shakespeare promote homosexuality anywhere in his works? The answer is yes. Line 2328 of his play, Henry V, reads, "Let me speak proudly. Tell the constable we are but warriors for the working day. Our gayness and our guilt are all besmirched, with rainy marching in the painful field." But then someone with sense comes along and objects by pointing out the fact that the word gay during Shakespeare's time didn't mean same-sex attraction, but light-hearted and carefree. However, instead of admitting his error, the masked Arab doubles down and responds, "Straw man! I meant homosexuality in the general sense, as an adjective that means light-hearted and carefree. Aww." Would anyone with any semblance of brain activity consider this to be a reasonable response? No. No, they would not. Moving on.
He also seems to speak of terrorism in the English language and tries to look for its etymological roots there when the Quran is, as we all know, an Arabic text. What we should be looking for is the word irhab and its root words, which is exactly what I did. It's still meant to terrorize back then, so this whole argument is a complete red herring. To unpack this a bit more, let me give you this example. The word torture in Arabic is adab, its root being the three letters, ayn, dal, ba. We find it in numerous places in the Quran. We find it at the beginning of chapter 24, which is Surah An-Nur, when the author of the Quran boasts about torturing those being punished for fornication by 100 lashes in front of a public crowd. And there are also numerous references to what the author vows will be torture in hellfire. Then, someone like the Jihadi comes along and claims that the specific English word for torture wasn't coined until the year 1540. By his logic, the mention of torture and torment in the Quran doesn't actually mean torture because the modern English equivalent of the word wasn't coined back then.
Here, the masked Arab attempts to undermine my point by yet again putting words in my mouth and providing a false analogy. Firstly, nowhere in my video do I mention the first known use of the word terrorism in English, or its etymology. Rather, I simply stated that it was impossible for any word in the Quran to be about terrorism, because the word wasn't invented until the 18th century during the French Revolution. In other words, the word never existed in any culture until this period. How the masked Arab could think I was referring to the word in English when I clearly stated that it was coined during the French Revolution by a French political party is utterly ridiculous. That said, the word torture has obviously been around far longer than its English equivalent. Therefore, showing the first known use of the word torture in English is merely a distraction from my objection, and is an actual example of a red herring fallacy. How ironic. First, let's take a look at the masked Arab's bibliography for this video. As you can see here, he references the tafsir and provides a link. But the commentary he provides is for chapter 8, verse 55, not for the verses he just mentioned prior, which were 8:12 and 8:60.
So here I mentioned the exegesis of Ibn Kathir, where he, in a nutshell, describes very well the concept of modern-day terrorism to explain a particular verse. The Ijtihadi points out that the exegesis was for a different verse to the ones I cited earlier. That's true. I didn't notice this until now. It's not a huge deal. I often write my scripts for the Arabic version first, and in those versions I can use a lot more references as I'm not held back by the lack of translations for Quranic commentaries, as I am with the English videos. Basically, the only commentaries we have translated in English that are reputable enough are Jalalain, which is very basic and brief and hardly ever goes into any detail, and Ibn Kathir, which is an abridged version of the Arabic original. That's pretty much it. The only other one we have a tiny bit of is that of Qurtubi, where we have translations for the first few chapters only. I'd love to see a full translation of Tabari's exegesis, but unfortunately, I don't think it exists yet. If you were to check the Arabic version of the same video, you'll see I actually used Tabari to show the context behind chapter 8 verse 60, which is one of the verses I cited. So this argument only applies to the English version because I'm limited to what I can show you in English given the lack of translations available. But this is yet another red herring, and we're only 10 minutes into the video. Instead of trying to refute the statements made in Ibn Kathir's tafsir, he simply points out I quoted the commentary for another verse without attempting to tackle the massive problems in the commentary we just read. The commentary here still exists, and it's still part of the Quran, even if I didn't quote the passage earlier. Let's quote it now if it triggered you so much. It's not as if I was hiding anything peaceful, I can tell you that. What does 8:55 read? Surely the vilest of animals in Allah's sight are those who disbelieve. Then they would not believe. So Ibn Kathir goes on to explain how infidels are so vile and how they should be dealt with.
Here, the Master Arab claims that the reason he cited the English commentary for a totally different verse was because he's limited by what he can show you from English translations. But this is obviously a poor excuse, because the very website he uses for English commentary provides a commentary for verse 60 as well. So I don't really understand how him citing the verse in his Arabic video from the Arabic version of a completely different commentary, i.e. Imam Tabari, somehow makes it impossible for him to cite the same verse from the English version of Ibn Kathir. Furthermore, Ibn Kathir is in both Arabic and English, so why not just use it for both his Arabic and English videos? Why use Imam Tabari in your Arabic video and then switch to Ibn Kathir in the English version, when the latter can be cited in both languages? So as far as I'm concerned, all this proves is that, once again, the Master Arab takes advantage of certain sources when they appear to suit his agenda, and neglects them when they don't. The Master Arab then goes on to claim that I've only mentioned this for the sake of avoiding what is plainly stated in the commentary for Surah 8 verse 55. But anyone who has watched my video knows this to be patently false, because I clearly state that the context of this verse has to do with military conflict. From the introductory commentary alone, it's apparent that this entire surah makes zero reference to the phenomenon of terrorism, because it's specifically talking about two opposing armies. In other words, the disbelievers mentioned in 8:55 concern military combatants only, not some random non-Muslims that just happen to be walking around minding their own business. That said, I still don't really see how the Master Arab can claim this verse is about terrorism, because it's clear in the commentary itself that it's specifically referring to warfare. If it was talking about terrorism, it wouldn't even need to specify the circumstance of war, because terrorism can happen at any time and in any place, regardless if there's a war or not. But what really puts the nail in the coffin is what the Master Arab has once again neglected to show his audience. Case in point, if we read the line below the portion he's highlighted, we find out exactly who this verse is being directed to as well as its purpose. And I quote, "So that they may learn a lesson." And what is that lesson? They might be careful not to break treaties, so that they do not meet the same end. So here we read that this verse is directed to military combatants who have initiated war with Muslims by breaking their peace treaties. The lesson here is for military aggressors, not some random disbelievers who just happen to be walking around minding their own business, as I've stated earlier. Even the verses following 8:55 specify the context for us without the need for any commentary. Verily, the worst of living creatures before Allah are those who disbelieve. They are those with whom you made a treaty, but they break their treaty every time and they do not fear Allah. So if you gain mastery over them in war, then disperse those who are behind them so that they may learn a lesson. Thus, once again, and not surprisingly, the masked Arab fails to defend his poor arguments from scrutiny. Moving on. From the introductory commentary alone, it's apparent that this entire surah makes zero reference to the phenomenon of terrorism, because it's specifically talking about two opposing armies. In other words, the disbelievers mentioned in 855 concern military combatants only, not some random non-Muslims that just happen to be walking around minding their own business.
So he claims that Ibn Kathir openly contradicts me. How so? Because he says this chapter was revealed about a battle? And how does this contradict me exactly? Does terrorism never happen during times of war? When ISIS was battling the coalition fighting it, did it not commit any terrorism because it was all done during times of battle? Is this really your logic? Are you suggesting that terrorism can only ever be against civilians? Does this mean that you don't think ISIS burning the Jordanian pilot, who was a combatant, was an act of terror, simply because he wasn't a civilian? Do you think ISIS massacring the cadets at Spiker Base in Iraq was not an act of terror? Spit it out. Show us your true colours, iJihadi. Be honest.
No. Two armies fighting each other is not terrorism. It's just warfare. You see, if I'm part of a military force and another soldier starts shooting at me, and I shoot back, this is not an act of terrorism. To even suggest such a thing would be ludicrous. Now, if you want, you can try and argue that what sometimes happens to soldiers during combat may be considered brutal or disproportionate. Be my guest. However, this still doesn't fit the definition of terrorism. As for my so-called true colors, quote-unquote, is the masked Arab also willing to ask the same question of the numerous non-Muslim academics and counterterrorism specialists I've cited throughout my previous videos, all of whom agree with my analysis? Or is he just going to continue ignoring the evidence because it's convenient for him to present me as some sort of extremist? I'm guessing it's going to be the latter. Moving on.
Also, when Ibn Kathir says the chapter was revealed concerning the Battle of Badr, he doesn't mean every single verse was revealed that way. Listen carefully again to what the iJihadi claims.
From the introductory commentary alone, it's apparent that this entire surah makes zero reference to the phenomenon of terrorism, because it's specifically talking about two opposing armies.
This is yet another embarrassing blunder by the iJihadi. He just claimed that the entire surah made zero reference to terrorism because he misread the commentary of Ibn Kathir as meaning, and I quote, the entire surah was about the Battle of Badr. The iJihadi here seems to be clueless about some of the most basic facts of Islamic history. He is either unaware of what the surah actually says, or he doesn't understand the basic timeline of Islamic history as given to us by the Sunnah. This is painfully obvious if you read verses 30 to 35 in that same chapter, Surah Al-Anfal, not Al-Anfal, which he says references Badr alone. These verses were clearly talking about events in Mecca and not in Medina, way before the Battle of Badr. Maybe the iJihadi doesn't realize that the Battle of Badr happened after the migrations of Muslims to Medina, otherwise he wouldn't have suggested that the whole chapter was referring to Badr. When Ibn Kathir says this, he talks about the bulk of the chapter and not all of it. So once again, very sloppy usage of what he calls facts that only shows he hasn't at all grasped the introductory commentary and jumped to ridiculous conclusions without checking the verses contained within the chapter.
Here, the master begins to become more pedantic by pointing out the fact that I said, the entire surah. Now, while I have no problem admitting that I should have been more careful with my language, this still does not take away from my main objection. You see, while it is certainly true that parts of this surah were revealed during the Meccan period and not the Medini period, the verses that the masked Arab referenced in his initial video, verses 12, 60, and 55, were revealed during the Medini period and are specifically about military combat, as I've already shown. Therefore, the masked Arab is still wrong in presenting these verses as evidence that the Quran promotes terrorism. In other words, this is yet again just another attempt by him to evade criticism. Moving on. Now, while we will be discussing the nature and details of this battle in a subsequent episode, for those who wish to argue that because these verses say the disbelievers, it therefore means all disbelievers, allow me to give you a brief lesson on how grammar works. You see, there are these things called definite articles, and they usually refer back to a more specific person, place, or thing. In other words, they don't always refer to a universal subject. For example, if I said that the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor during World War II, it would be obvious that I'm not referring to all Japanese people. but specifically the Japanese military during World War II. No one with any semblance of intelligence would think otherwise. Likewise, if I said that the Americans defeated the Germans in World War II, no one would assume I meant every single American or every single German citizen. Such nuance applies even more so to cases of demonstrative and relative pronouns. So if this is going to be your counter-response, I beg you, please, spare your brain cells.
Wow, okay. I agree with what you just said in general. So if I said the Muslims kill innocent civilians over and over and over again in bomb attacks and rape Yazidi women, I'm expecting you to jump to my defense if I get criticized for that statement, because I never said every single Muslim at the beginning of that sentence. Right? No, you wouldn't defend me for making that statement. And why not? Are you selective in your application of how the definite article should be understood? Should I make clear that I didn't mean every single Muslim? Yes? Well, maybe the Quran should also make it clear here too. That's surely not too much to ask, is it?
Yes, actually I would defend the masked Arab statement. And why? Because the notion that 1.8 billion people are all conducting bomb attacks and raping Yazidi women in Iraq is utterly impossible and absurd. If this were really the case, then humanity as we know it would probably cease to exist. Now, if the masked Arab happened to be one of those right-wing nutjobs who believes that every Muslim in the world is conspiring to kill everyone, it would have to be made apparent by other statements surrounding this one. You see, unlike the masked Arab, I don't believe that the context needs to be made apparent within the statement itself, because unlike the masked Arab, I have a reasonable standard of communication.
Let's try another example for you. If I said, kill the Muslims wherever you find them, when there's an inevitable backlash against my disgusting hypothetical statement, would it suffice for me to say, no, I didn't say every single Muslim. When I said kill the Muslims wherever you find them, I meant those 30 Muslims over there about to run at us with suicide bomb vests. Will you immediately make up similar excuses for my bold statements? No? Didn't think so.
Yes, and I would defend the masked Arab here as well, because if he's literally pointing at 30 suicide bombers who are about to kill us, then it's apparent what the context of this statement is. Once again, I can say this because unlike the masked Arab, I don't have an unreasonable standard of communication. Moving on. So let's read what Ibn Kathir has to say about this verse. Allah's statement, I will cast terror into the hearts of those who have disbelieved, means, you, angels, support the believers, strengthen their battlefront against their enemies, thus implementing my command to you. I will cast fear, disgrace, and humiliation over those who defied my command and denied my messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Arabi bin Anas said, in the aftermath of Badr, the people used to recognize whomever the angels killed from those whom they killed by the wounds over their necks, fingers, and toes, because those parts had a mark as if they were branded by fire. So if it wasn't already apparent, this verse is not a direct command to Muslims, but to the angels in support of the Muslims during a military conflict. It's even stated in the verse itself.
I never said Muslims here, I said believers. I'm not going to accuse you of strawmanning me on this occasion, as I think it's a subtle difference you may not have noticed. I worded it that way because angels and Muslims are both believers in God and Islam according to your own mythology. And according to the tafsirs, this instruction can be understood as a command for either, depending on the exegete in question. So saying believers would include both. Of course, the I-Jihadi is once again clueless to the fact that this can be an instruction to humans, as we'll soon see, recently stating that it's not even debatable and an issue for good old reading comprehension. Yet he can't even read Arabic as far as I'm aware. The sentence can be broken down to mean the instruction is in fact given to humans and not angels. Don't take my word for it. Just go to the classical Muslim scholars and you'll see this is the case. I don't think he's deliberately hiding this from his audience, I just think he's completely ignorant when it comes to what the exegetes actually say on the verse. Another reason he should be a bit more humble. On Twitter he calls anyone who claims it's anything but an instruction to angels as an idiot. In that case, some of Islam's most prominent exegetes were idiots too. People like Al-Akhfash, Al-Dhahhak and Atiyah, who all said it was an instruction given to humans and not angels.
Here, the masked Arab makes two accusations. The first being that I apparently was unaware of the secondary interpretation which suggests that this verse is a command to Muslims, and the second being that I accused anyone who follows the secondary interpretation of being stupid. Now, before I go on, let me just say that I'm completely baffled that anyone would take either of these accusations seriously. Allow me to show you why. In regards to the first accusation, it's clear from my very own video that I was aware of the secondary interpretation of this verse, because I even said there was a secondary interpretation of this verse. Now, a non-Muslim doesn't have to believe this story if they don't want to. That's perfectly fine. However, to claim that this verse is a command to Muslims to torture and mutilate non-combatants is simply false. Even the secondary interpretation of this verse, which suggests that it may be a command to the Muslims, does not promote any sort of torture or mutilation of non-combatants, but simply states that Muslims aim for every part of their enemies' bodies during, once again, military conflict. And what does secondary mean? Coming after, less important than, or resulting from someone or something else that is primary. So how is it possible that I was unaware of the secondary interpretation of this verse when I clearly state there's a secondary interpretation of this verse? Moving on to the masked Arab's second accusation, where he insists that I believe anyone who follows a secondary interpretation must be stupid, this is also patently false. It is so false that its falsehood is even evidenced in the very tweet he uses to accuse me of this. Here you can clearly read what my tweet says, and I quote, "Is there any reasonable way to read Surah 8:12 as a command to Muslims to commit terrorism?" Of course I'm going to think that anyone who believes this to be a command to Muslims to commit terrorism is obviously stupid. And I think it's very clear in my video that I don't believe the scholars who adopted the secondary interpretation are stupid, because I don't believe the secondary interpretation is a command to Muslims to commit terrorism. Even the secondary interpretation of this verse, which suggests that it may be a command to the Muslims, does not promote any sort of torture or mutilation of non-combatants, but simply states that Muslims aim for every part of their enemies' bodies during, once again, military conflict. So if I'm the one who has problems with reading comprehension, then God help you. Moving on.
Notice here how he strawmans me yet again. He says I claimed this was a command to mutilate and torture non-combatants. When did I ever say this was a command to torture and mutilate non-combatants? If that were the case, I would have put it in my killing innocent civilians video. A gentle reminder for you, if you constantly need to build a straw man to attack my positions, it means your arguments are incredibly weak, necessitating the use of such dishonest methods.
Here, the masked Arab claims he never said Surah 8 verse 12 teaches Muslims to mutilate and torture non-combatants. Really? Perhaps he needs a reminder.
I'd like to ask any Muslims this question regarding the latter part of this verse. It asks the believers to cast terror into the hearts of infidels and strike off their heads and their fingertips. But which one do you do first? Are you supposed to chop off the head first and then chop off the fingertips, or do you chop off the fingertips first? Either way, this is horrific and it's straight from the Quran. If you chop off the head first and then go for the fingertips, then you're just mutilating a dead body. If it's done the other way around and you chop off the fingers first and then the head, then you're just torturing people before killing them. What's the purpose here of mutilation or torture? Please explain how you can accept this verse and which one you think goes first. Then tell us why you think the mutilation or torture is merited. If you want to argue that they're done at the same time, then what's the point of going for the fingertips? What purpose does that serve? So, in a general sense, we see that these verses advocate the use of terrorism.
Oh, God.
I mean, at this point, I'm not really surprised by his level of deception. I'm just astonished that anyone with sense would take him seriously. I have literally never seen someone try this hard to weasel their way out of criticism. Perhaps it's time for the masked Arab to follow his own advice.
A gentle reminder for you, if you constantly need to build a straw man to attack my positions, it means your arguments are incredibly weak, necessitating the use of such dishonest methods. I like how he just brushes over all this so quickly, and then presents a false dichotomy and a silly clip in order to try and completely ignore the hadiths that completely shatter his entire argument. Firstly, neither of those hadiths suggested anywhere that it was referring only to combatants. If you are going to make that claim, then you need to have the hadith say something of the sort. You can't just pull it out of thin air. Crying out of context when the hadith itself makes no mention of any context that makes it exclusively for combatants is not an argument.
Here, the masked Arab claims that the only way the ahadith can be understood as pertaining to combatants is if the context is specified therein. In other words, the masked Arab believes that the context of this statement cannot be ascertained from external sources, such as other ahadith or verses from the Quran. But if that's really the case, then the masked Arab undermines his own argument, because the hadith doesn't specify non-combatants either. Therefore, it's impossible for him to use this hadith as concrete evidence that Islam promotes terrorism. That said, I think I've already proven in my video that these ahadith pertain to combatants, because unlike the masked Arab, I hold to a far more reasonable standard of communication that doesn't limit my understanding of context to the statement itself. But to truly showcase the absurdity of the masked Arab's argument, allow me to give you an analogy. Imagine that I send a text message to my wife telling her, "Salam, sweetie, I'm going to the game now with the guys. Love you." And she responds, "Okay, love, have fun." Now, these statements are far more simple than the ahadith mentioned prior, but according to the masked Arab, it's impossible for my wife, or anyone else, to understand what I've just texted her, because the context of these words aren't specified in the statement itself. For example, what does salam mean? What does the word sweetie mean? How am I going anywhere? What game am I talking about? And who are these guys? Now, a person who follows a reasonable standard of communication would think that the context can be derived from external sources, such as prior conversations between me and my wife, or earlier text messages I've sent her. But according to the masked Arab, that's not possible. Therefore, in order for this statement to make any sense, I'd have to write it like this. Salam, shorthand Islamic greeting meaning peace. Sweetie, a nickname for my significant other. I'm going by car to the game, a United States sporting competition akin to rugby, but called football because American English is weird. Now, this very moment, with the guys, my close male friends. Love, in more than a platonic way, you, my wife. Of course, no one actually communicates this way, because it's not necessary to write infinitely long sentences where we have to explain the context for every single word. And in fact, the example I just gave you is pretty concise. Technically, according to the masked Arab's reasoning, this sentence could go on forever, because even the words that explain the context would need to be explained themselves ad infinitum. But in all truth, the masked Arab probably doesn't really follow this absurd standard of communication, especially when he's speaking or writing to others. He only invokes this standard when he's being criticized, because that's the only way he can defend his poor arguments. Moving on.
And as if he hasn't already set a new world record in the accumulation of logical fallacies throughout his disastrous abortion of a rebuttal, he goes on to provide us with a rather cute false dichotomy. A false dichotomy he will keep repeating because he has no actual arguments. Either you are a pacifist who won't even defend himself, or you use terror. No options apparently exist for purely advocating self-defense and maintaining ethics during wartime. Nope, no such options exist. It's either the most ridiculous form of pacifism or terror.
Here, the masked Arab claims that I'm setting up some sort of false dichotomy. However, all I said was that scaring enemy combatants shouldn't startle anyone other than a delusional pacifist, because there is nothing unethical about scaring an enemy combatant. The purpose of war is not to make your enemies feel at peace and comfort by your presence. So if the masked Arab is still arguing for the word terrorism in the general sense, quote-unquote, as a verb that means to inflict fear, then I don't see why he would object to my reasoning.
But even with this absurd false dichotomy, his arguments still fail once more. You see, in the second hadith, we see Muhammad saying that these attributes were given distinctly to him and not to other prophets, and these included the use of terror. So is the al-Jihadi claiming that no single other prophet ever had to fight? Were they all pacifists according to his genius dichotomy? If that's the case, does this mean that Muhammad is just more troublesome than the others? Does it mean he resorted to violence quicker than any of his predecessors? Either way, nothing here bodes well for your prophet.
Here, the masked Arab attempts to be clever by conflating the word terror with warfare. But this isn't going to work. You see, just because the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was helped by Allah in scaring his enemies, it doesn't necessitate that other prophets didn't go to war. All it means is that the Prophet ﷺ had an advantage with respect to war. That's it. This hadith does not imply that the other prophets were somehow averse to scaring their enemies, or that they refrained from doing so. But nice try. Moving on. That aside, the masked Arab once again neglects to show whether these verses are addressing civilians or military combatants. And by this point, I believe he's doing so deliberately. Why? Well, first notice how he no longer relies on Ibn Kathir when attempting to explain Surah 48 verse 29. Rather, he references Imam Suyuti, the 15th to 16th century scholar who co-wrote a more vague commentary by the name of Tafsir al-Jalalain. He then goes on to mention Surah 9 verse 123, but curiously doesn't attach any commentary at all. And then he does something even more peculiar. He mentions Surah 5 verse 54 within Ibn Kathir's tafsir, as a supplement to his commentary on Surah 48 verse 29. Yes, that's right. The masked Arab is quoting a verse within the commentary of another verse.
Oh, this is so ridiculous. He's really clutching at straws now, desperate for a gotcha moment. Does he really think by saying, yes, that's right, he just read the tafsir of Ibn Kathir, was somehow going to impress anyone out there with more than 3 brain cells? Firstly, I'm not the one quoting another verse from inside this verse. Ibn Kathir is. And there's nothing wrong with him using examples from other verses to help provide more context to the present verse. It's so ridiculous that he thinks this is somehow a gotcha.
Here, it seems that the masked Arab doesn't really understand what the problem is with quoting a supplementary verse in the commentary of another verse. But this is a major issue. You see, if you're going to argue that a certain verse supports your interpretation, then you should just quote the commentary of the verse itself. If you quote the verse within another verse's commentary as a supplement, then you're removing the context in which it's being used. Case in point, if the overarching commentary of verse 4829 is about specific disbelievers, such as military combatants and not civilians just minding their own business, then you're clearly misrepresenting the use of 554. So pardon me for expecting others to have academic integrity. For example, the Quran states in the following 2 verses of Surah 60, Allah does not forbid you to deal kindly and justly with anyone who has not fought you for your faith or driven you out of your homes. Allah loves the just. Allah only forbids you to take as allies those who have fought against you for your faith, driven you out of your homes, and helped others to drive you out. Any of you who take them as allies will truly be wrongdoers. Thus, the Quran makes it explicitly clear that the only people who are to be treated with harshness are those who actively persecute the Muslims, fighting them and driving them out from their homes. Now, one may retort that these verses were abrogated by later verses, which seem to advocate all-out war against every single disbeliever, whether they be soldiers or civilians.
Okay, so you're accepting that there are exegetes out there who say this was abrogated, so you've already debunked yourself. What's the point of continuing with this argument? Are you going to show us one example of someone saying it isn't? Don't you see the problem of quoting abrogated verses as if they're still universally accepted as binding when they clearly aren't?
Here, the masked Arab is once again putting words in my mouth. Nowhere did I admit that exegetes say that this verse has been abrogated. It's not even implied anywhere in my statement. All I said was that one may retort that these verses were abrogated. Here, I'm preparing to respond to a potential counter-argument, a counter-argument that the masked Arab himself makes in the second video of his series.
In order to try and prove their point, apologists will often repeat verses like these around to try and pull the wool over your eyes. There is no compulsion in religion. Fight in the cause of Allah those who fight you, but do not transgress limits, for Allah loveth not transgressors. But the problem with these verses is that they are widely believed to have been cancelled out by later verses within the Muslim concept of abrogation, which tries to explain all the contradictions by suggesting the verses revealed later supersede the earlier ones if they contradict each other. We are told by the major exegetes of the Quran that this verse has been abrogated by later verses which command the killing of non-believers.
So no, I don't debunk myself just because I'm anticipating a counter-argument and responding to it. The fact that I have to explain this is astonishing. More specifically, one might mention Surah 9, verse 5. When the 4 forbidden months are over, wherever you encounter the idolaters, kill them, seize them, besiege them, wait for them at every lookout post. But if they turn to Allah, maintain the prayer, and pay the prescribed alms, let them go on their way, for Allah is most forgiving and merciful. At a later point in this episode, we'll discuss this verse in more detail, but in the meantime, let's address this counter-argument, once again using the masked Arab's very own references. Firstly, it should be noted that neither Ibn Kathir nor Imam Suyuti claim that the 2 verses in Surah 60 were abrogated. More importantly, however, Ibn Kathir openly states his opposition to the idea that Surah 9 verse 5 abrogates previous passages. He makes this clear in his commentary on Surah 2, 190 to 191, where he states the following.
Whoa, hold up. Remember that only a few minutes earlier he made a massive deal out of me using the tafsir of another verse to make a point about a verse I was on. In my case, it was Ibn Kathir himself who had laid out his commentary in that way. Here, the Ijtihadi does the exact same thing he had a massive problem with only a minute ago. But here he goes to another verse all on his own. It's not even referenced within the verse he's talking about. Now, to be clear, I don't have a problem with him doing this at all because it's not a big deal. But it seems this guy has zero self-awareness and does the exact same thing he himself had an issue with only a few minutes ago.
Here, the masked Arab tries to make a connection between his deceptive methodology and my referencing of Ibn Kathir on the subject of Surah 2 verse 190 being abrogated. But this is absurd. You see, if I want to find out if a certain verse was abrogated, in this case 2:190, then I should reference the commentary of 2:190, because that would be the most logical place to look. I'm not going to go look in the commentary of a completely different verse to figure out if 2:190 has been abrogated. So no, this is clearly not the same as cherry-picking your references for the sake of deceiving your audience. Moving on. And fight in the way of Allah those who fight you. Abu al-Aliyah said, this was the first ayah about fighting that was revealed in Al-Madinah. Ever since it was revealed, Allah's Messenger ﷺ used to fight only those who fought him and avoid non-combatants.
So you're reading opinions cited by Ibn Kathir that he doesn't necessarily agree with, yet opinions nonetheless by exegetes prior to him who saw this as a command to kill civilians. So you're just making my argument for me by showing that this interpretation was out there, and this is how some scholars understood the Quran. Once again, you've just debunked your entire video once more.
Here, the masked Arab claims that I've debunked my own videos because I've shown where one scholar references another scholar he disagrees with. But this is also absurd, because not only is it nonsensical to believe that every interpretation is valid, but the masked Arab's own reasoning is self-refuting. You see, according to the masked Arab's logic, him quoting me and my opposing arguments in his own video also debunks his entire video. Talk about shooting yourself in the foot. Moving on.
But let's see where he goes with this. I think he's going to tell us that Ibn Kathir didn't think this was the correct opinion, which only tells us that it was a matter of dispute in interpretation.
Later, Surah 9 was revealed. Abdurrahman bin Zayd bin Aslam said similarly. Then he said that this was later abrogated by the ayah, then kill them wherever you find them. However, this statement is not plausible, because Allah's statement, those who fight you, applies only to fighting the enemies who are engaged in fighting Islam and its people. So the ayah means, fight those who fight you. Just as Allah said in another ayah, and fight against the mushrikeen collectively as they fight against you collectively.
So here his entire argument is based on the words, however, this statement is not plausible. He believes this is what Ibn Kathir actually said, and Ibn Kathir wrote his tafsir in Arabic and not English. So let's see whether this sentence, which he bases his whole argument on, exists in the Arabic text of his commentary. Here it is, the exact same portion of Ibn Kathir, and what does it say? There's only one word here that was somehow translated to that big sentence, and that word is nadar, which simply means opinion. In this context, it would have made much more sense to translate this as an alternative opinion, rather than, however, this statement is not plausible, which adds in numerous words that are nowhere to be seen in the original. I don't know whether this was mistranslated on purpose. I know there are many instances of clearly dishonest translations, but I can't blame the Ijtihadi for thinking this is what Ibn Kathir said, when he actually said something far from it. I think he, like the vast majority of Muslims, cannot speak the Arabic language, and that's fair enough.
Here, the masked Arab gets so desperate he begins questioning the translation of his own references. However, anyone who speaks more than one language knows you can't translate something word for word because it sounds ridiculous. When translating from one language to another, especially one with an entirely different syntax, you have to take into account how the words are being used. So while it is true that the word nadar can be literally translated as opinion, its use here by Ibn Kathir is not simply opinion. In fact, he was using it in a very specific manner, and there is evidence of this in the Islamic tradition itself. We need only quote the 13th century scholar of Islamic jurisprudence, Imam Najmuddin al-Tufi. Writing less than a century prior to Ibn Kathir, al-Tufi explains the use of the word nadar by the scholarly class. And I quote, "The meaning of those who say in this word or in this opinion, i.e. nadar, is that it needs re-evaluation because it appears to be corrupt at its foundation. This is not said in what appears to be sound or absolutely corrupt. This word is only used when judging a claim that appears to be invalid. So if this word was mentioned regarding a specific issue or claim, then that claim is regarded as corrupt or weak. And if it was said regarding any claim, its authenticity is also put into question. This word is a sign of illegitimacy from the one who says it. Now, it's not surprising that the masked Arab is unaware of this, because as I have explained to him earlier on Twitter, there is a major difference between being able to speak colloquial Arabic and comprehending formal Arabic. Just because you possess one doesn't make you capable of the other. So while it is certainly true that I have difficulty pronouncing formal Arabic terms,
it's pronounced Surat al-Anfal.
At least I can understand them. Moving on.
And here it is for all to see, ladies and gentlemen. I rest my case once again. Do you remember when only a minute ago he told us the Quran and Ibn Kathir were incredibly clear on the treatment of civilians? I asked whether I or him, as his former disbelieving self, would count as a civilian by his standards. Clearly, we're not civilians. Just read the list of prohibitions he cites as being super clear on what to do with civilians. Killing women, children, and old people who do not participate in warfare. So firstly, you're allowed to kill them if they are deemed to be participating in warfare. But civilian men are strangely missing from this list. Are we not considered civilians? Why not? Is your definition of civilian solely women, children, and the elderly? You see how this is a huge problem that the Quran doesn't seem to be addressing. What about non-Muslim civilian men? Why the omission? You brush over this as if you hadn't noticed the glaring problem. Anyway, once more, your argument fails from the very sources you are using to try and prove your point.
This is the masked Arab's last desperate attempt at defending his poor arguments. Here, he suggests that because Ibn Kathir doesn't specifically mention civilian men, it must be because he's endorsing terrorism. But his assumption is ludicrous for two reasons. The first being that priests and residents of houses of worship are obviously civilian men. So Ibn Kathir is not excluding men here like some radical feminist. Rather, he's specifying the groups that are not normally considered soldiers. And this leads to the second reason why the masked Arab's assumption is false, because he doesn't understand history. You see, back then, most men of my age would have been considered soldiers by virtue of the fact that men didn't really have an option to refrain from combat, unless they had a valid excuse. In other words, most mature men were obligated to participate in warfare. Therefore, the reason Ibn Kathir doesn't specifically mention civilian men is because such a category didn't really exist back then, because most men were soldiers. Now, before going into my closing analysis, I'd like to give a quick shout out to someone I should have mentioned a long time ago. Brother Ahmed Al-Rawi, a student from Iraq who has helped me in the past with Arabic sources. More importantly, however, he has developed several refutations toward the masked Arab on his blog and YouTube channel, both of which are linked in the info box. So please subscribe to him. I believe he is now focusing his attention on another atheist ex-Muslim by the name of Sharif Gaber, so you should find his arguments helpful. With all that said, let's summarize the masked Arab's response. First, he spends 30 minutes smearing my character to the point of accusing me of criminal terroristic activity, claiming I was trying to get someone murdered because they criticized my beliefs. Then he treats my refutation just like he treats Islamic sources, by putting words in my mouth and misrepresenting me. And then he goes so far as to twist his own arguments in order to evade criticism. Now, after all this, I have no interest in responding to the masked Arab any further, because if this is the best he can do, then it's just a waste of my time. But there's also another reason that I don't want anything to do with him from this point forward. You see, there's something else he's done that wasn't mentioned in his response, but on Twitter, and I think it's very important that I address it, not only for the sake of my audience, but his. So after I announced that I would be responding to the masked Arab's response, he tweeted the following. I was thinking, if you retract your smears, admit your errors, publicly apologize, and beg for mercy, I might let you off the hook for what's coming soon in another vid. You have 24 hours. Now, at first, I thought he was just being melodramatic and quote-unquote threatening me with his poor arguments. But then I read this. He's hiding a nasty secret that the Muslims and non-Muslims should be aware of. That's all I'll say. His pride won't let him, but once it's out, he'll be wishing he begged for mercy. By this point, I began to interpret this as a real threat, because this obviously can't be about my views, because all of those are in public. Case in point, you can go to my public Facebook page to find out what I think about apostasy, jihad, etc. So the only possible interpretation of this statement is that the Master believes he has incriminating personal information on me. And although I'm unaware of what sort of incriminating personal information the Master thinks he possesses, this is clearly a threat to silence me. And this is exactly how I reacted to it. Now, for those of you who think I'm being paranoid, imagine if the roles were reversed. Retract your videos, admit you were wrong, and publicly apologize to me and beg for mercy. If you don't do this within 24 hours, I'm going to reveal a nasty secret about you. Honestly, how would that be interpreted? I think we all know the answer. The person saying this would be accused of being an extremist who is trying to stifle free speech. But there shouldn't be any double standard when it comes to these sort of threats. Unless someone is harming you in real life through their videos, such as slandering you, this is inexcusable. We as a civilized society should not condone or allow this sort of behavior from anyone, regardless if we agree with them or not. The moment we give threats like this a free pass is the moment we've undermined the principle of free speech itself. That said, after his threat, I made it very clear that I would not be coerced into silence. Finally, after some time, the Master backed down and offered this faux retraction of his threat. Now, while I've accepted his retraction, it's been very difficult for me to take it seriously. Thus, I've already taken some precautionary measures, meaning if he decides to renege on his retraction, I'm fully prepared at this point to engage law enforcement and legal counsel both in the United States and the United Kingdom. And I can say with a great deal of confidence that this would not be good for the Master because I can guarantee his identity would be compromised. So let's hope he has some sense in his next response and addresses my arguments rather than trying to harm me personally. And to be perfectly honest, I'm actually really shocked and disgusted by this, because as far as I can recall, none of the other people I've criticized on my iJihad series have ever threatened me. For example, when I criticized Griffix in episode 1, she just ignored me. And when I criticized Crownton T, a rabid anti-immigration Islamophobe who is known for doxing people, all he did was insult me. But he never threatened me with harm. And when I criticized one of the most popular atheists on YouTube, Sargon of Akkad, a person who is obviously not a fan of Islam, all that led to was a cordial conversation on Skype where we eventually talked about our hobbies and family lives. And even when I've had disagreements outside of YouTube with other ex-Muslims, such as the founder and president of the Atheist Republic, Armin Navabi, we too had a cordial conversation.
The point is that you already achieved your goal the moment you started discussion, because the more we talk, the less we're fighting each other personally, right? And the more dialect we have, the more we're going to understand each other. So if somebody is listening to you without each other fighting personally, you have already won. So, and if you could record that like we are and demonstrate that to more people, that is possible. Because here's the thing, you know what I'm going to do with this video?
Okay.
And similar other videos? Because a lot of times I say like, no, we people that are saying that, why are you not against Muslims? I like, because I'm not against people, and we need to talk to them. And people are like, well, good luck with that. No Muslim would ever have a friendly conversation with you. Oh, they're gonna kill you or something before they talk to you, right? Then what I'm gonna be like, no, look, here's an example. And then I send them another link. Like, here's another example. Here's another example. And I have these as like trophies. As like whenever people say that, oh, Muslims are never going to talk to you, like, you're wrong. There you go.
Guys, call off the ninjas. Armin is good. Wait, I mean, what were you saying? So, no, look, here's the bottom line. I don't care, as a Muslim myself, as far as my ethics are concerned, and what I consider to be Islamic. If I saw Armin on the street and somebody was harassing you or trying to beat you up or something, I would come to your aid. I don't question whether or not your beliefs in that respect. I see something unjust and I'll do something about it. In the same way, I think that it can be done for other people as well. I have no issue with you. I understand you disagree. And the thing is, we can flesh that out. And I think that we can have heated discussions even, without having to, harm each other in any way, shape, or form. All of the people I just mentioned have been targets of my criticisms in one way or another. but neither of them have ever attempted to threaten me or coerce me into silence. The only people who have ever threatened me for criticizing them have been ISIS supporters, and now an ex-Muslim on YouTube who ironically claims to stand for rationality and free speech. And no, I don't think it's a coincidence that they both wear masks. So let's summarize all this again, shall we? The masked Arab has not only attempted to undermine my credibility by accusing me of criminal terroristic behavior, misrepresented my arguments through deception, and misrepresented his own arguments just to evade criticism, but now he's gone so far as to threaten me if I don't stop criticizing him. All of this just because I accused him of intellectual dishonesty. Therefore, I have no interest in engaging any further with such low-class behavior, and I will not be addressing any of the Masked Arab's videos or comments in the future, because as far as I'm concerned, he doesn't deserve the attention of any civilized person. But before closing the gates entirely, I'd like to ask the Masked Arab a personal question, one which I want him to answer to himself. Man to mask. Was it Islam that made you an extremist, or was it just you?